The funeral home was more crowded than I expected. I counted 47 people from my seat in the back row, tucked into the corner where the light didn't quite reach and where an old man in a dark coat and sunglasses could sit unnoticed. My son David stood at the front, next to the closed casket that supposedly held my body. He was wearing the same black suit he'd worn to his wedding 3 years ago, and he was crying. Not sobbing. David had never been a sobber, but steady, controlled tears that ran down his face while he spoke into the microphone about what a great father I'd been. "Robert Henley was the most generous man I ever knew," David said, his voice breaking at just the right moments. "He gave everything to his family, everything he had, and now that he's gone, I hope he knew how much we loved him." I watched from the back row, 73 years old and very much alive, and thought about the phone call I'd received 6 days earlier from a nurse at Riverside Memory Care who'd said, "Mr. Henley, I'm calling about your father Robert. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding was that I wasn't dead. I wasn't even sick. I was at home, watching a baseball game, when my son told the memory care facility, the one he'd moved me into 3 months ago against my will by using a fraudulent power of attorney, that I had died peacefully in my sleep. He'd signed forms, arranged cremation, contacted a funeral home, sent announcements to relatives, planned a memorial service, all while I was sitting in room 247 of Riverside Memory Care, very much alive, asking anyone who'd listen that I didn't belong there and that my son had put me there to steal my house. Nobody had listened, until Nurse Patricia Chun did a routine bed check, found me reading a book instead of being dead, and made the phone call that saved my life. I'd been out of Riverside for 5 days now. David didn't know. The facility had agreed to keep it quiet while the state investigated what they were calling potential elder abuse and fraud. So I'd come to my own funeral to see what David would say, what my family really thought of me, what they'd do with what they thought they'd won. And sitting in that back row, listening to my son eulogize the father he'd tried to erase, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Anger was too hot, too unfocused. What I felt was cold, calculated. The absolute clarity that comes when you finally understand that the person you raised is capable of things you never imagined. And that clarity told me exactly what I needed to do next. Welcome to Family Reckoning. I'm grateful you're here for this one. Before we begin, drop your state or country in the comments so I can see where this story is reaching. And a quick note, this story contains fictionalized elements for dramatic and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual people or events is coincidental. But the lesson at the core? That's as real as it gets. Let's begin. I need to go back 6 months to explain how I ended up at Riverside Memory Care in the first place. I was living in the house I'd owned since 1979. A 3-bedroom colonial in a decent neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. Mortgage paid off in 2001. Property taxes manageable on my pension and Social Security. I was 72, healthy, independent, living exactly the life I wanted. My wife Margaret had died in 2015. Cancer. We'd been married 46 years. After she died, I'd learned how to live alone, how to cook for one person, how to fill the silence. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine and I was managing. David was my only child. He lived 20 minutes away with his wife Amber and their 2 kids. He visited occasionally, birthdays, holidays, the obligatory check-ins that adult children do when they're busy with their own lives. The visits had become more frequent starting in January of this year. First, I'd been pleased. Then I'd become suspicious, because every visit followed the same pattern. David would ask how I was doing, then shift to questions about my health, my memory, my ability to manage daily tasks. "Dad, have you been forgetting things? Are you taking your medications correctly? Have you been getting confused? Leaving the stove on? Missing appointments?" The answer to all of it was no. I was 72, not 92. I took my blood pressure medication every morning with breakfast. I'd never left the stove on. I'd never missed an appointment. But David kept pushing. And in March, he showed up with pamphlets about memory care facilities. Just in case, he said. For the future. I want to make sure we're prepared if something happens. Nothing's happening, I said. Dad, you're not getting any younger. Mom died at 71. I just want to make sure you're safe. That's when I should have seen it. The way he connected Margaret's death to my age. The implication that 72 was somehow the danger zone. The setup. But I didn't see it. Because he was my son and I trusted him. The power of attorney David had me sign was presented to me in April. He'd brought his lawyer, a man named Kenneth Voss who had the kind of smile that made you feel like you were being handled rather than helped. Mr. Henley, Kenneth had said, sitting at my kitchen table with a folder full of documents. David has asked me to help you establish some basic estate planning tools. Very standard stuff. A power of attorney in case something happens, and you need someone to make medical or financial decisions on your behalf. I can make my own decisions, I'd said. Of course you can. This is just a precaution. It only activates if you become incapacitated. Otherwise, it has no effect. I'd read the documents, or rather, I tried to read them. Legal language, dense paragraphs, words that seemed to say one thing but probably meant another. What exactly does incapacitated mean? I'd asked. It means unable to make or communicate decisions, Kenneth said. Unconscious, severely ill, mentally incompetent. It's a high bar. This is just to protect you. David had put his hand on my shoulder. Dad, I'd never use this unless I absolutely had to. You know that. I signed it. Because he was my son. Because the lawyer had said it was standard. Because I trusted that the people who claimed to be protecting me actually were. I'd signed away my autonomy on April 15th in my own kitchen with my son's hand on my shoulder and a lawyer who'd been paid to make it sound reasonable. Comment still here if you're locked in. This gets darker before it gets better. David used the power of attorney on July 9th. I found out when I tried to access my bank account and discovered it had been frozen. I called the bank. They told me that David Henley, acting as my power of attorney, had placed a hold on all my accounts pending a capacity evaluation. A what? I said. A capacity evaluation. To determine if you're mentally competent to manage your own finances. It's standard procedure when someone with POA has concerns about cognitive decline. I don't have cognitive decline. I understand, Mr. Henley, but according to the documentation we received, your POA has medical records indicating otherwise. You'll need to speak with him directly about next steps. I called David immediately. Dad, don't panic. I'm handling this. Handling what? Why is my bank account frozen? Because I'm worried about you. You've been confused lately, making poor decisions. I think you need to be evaluated by a doctor. I'm not confused. I'm fine. You left the stove on last week. You forgot to pay your electric bill. These are warning signs. None of that was true. I'd never left the stove on. I'd never missed a bill payment in 50 years. I don't know what you're talking about, I said. That's the problem, Dad. You don't remember. That's why we need to get you evaluated. I've made an appointment with Dr. Crenshaw for tomorrow. Just a simple cognitive test. To establish a baseline. Dr. Crenshaw. I'd never heard the name before. I have my own doctor, I said. Dr. Merrick retired 6 months ago. Don't you remember? Dr. Merrick had retired. I'd been meaning to find a new primary care physician but hadn't gotten around to it. Fine, I said. I'll go to the appointment, but then you unfreeze my accounts. Of course, David said. As soon as Dr. Crenshaw confirms you're okay. Dr. Crenshaw's evaluation happened on July 10th in an office that smelled like antiseptic and carpet cleaner. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, and had the detached professionalism of someone who'd done this evaluation 1,000 times and had stopped seeing the people taking it as people. He asked me questions. What year was it? Who was the president? Count backward from 100 by sevens. Remember these 3 words. Apple, table, penny. I answered everything correctly. I knew I did. At the end, Dr. Crenshaw had looked at his clipboard and said, Mr. Henley, I'm seeing some mild cognitive impairment. Nothing severe, but enough that I'd recommend additional monitoring. Possibly a more structured living environment. I answered everything correctly, I'd said. You missed several items on the recall test. And according to your son's report, you've been experiencing confusion at home, memory gaps, difficulty managing daily tasks. That's not true. Dr. Crenshaw had made a note on his clipboard. Lack of insight into one's own cognitive decline is actually a symptom of the decline itself. I'm going to recommend that you consider assisted living or memory care. For your own safety. I'd walked out of that office knowing I'd been set up. That Dr. Crenshaw had written his conclusion before I'd even walked in. That David had paid him or convinced him that I was incompetent so he could justify what came next. What came next was Riverside Memory Care. David moved me into Riverside on July 18th. He showed up at my house with 2 men in polo shirts who worked for a moving company. Dad, we found a great place for you. Just temporary while we get your health sorted out. But you'll be safer there. People to help you. Medical staff on site. I don't need medical staff. I'm fine. Dr. Crenshaw disagrees. And legally, I have the authority to make this decision. The power of attorney. The one I'd signed in April. You said it only activated if I was incapacitated. You are incapacitated, Dad. You just don't realize it. That's part of the disease. I wasn't incapacitated. I wasn't diseased. But David had a legal document signed by me, and a doctor's evaluation that said otherwise, and 2 moving men who started packing my belongings, while I stood in my own living room feeling my life being dismantled around me. Riverside Memory Care was a single-story building surrounded by a fence that was too high to be decorative and too secure to be anything but a barrier. The doors locked from the outside. The windows didn't open. The residents, patients, wandered the hallways in varying states of confusion, some talking to people who weren't there, some staring at walls, some sleeping in chairs. I didn't belong there. I told the nurses. I told the staff. I told anyone who'd listen. I'm not supposed to be here. My son put me here to steal my house. I'm not sick. I don't have dementia. This is kidnapping. They nodded sympathetically. They made notes in charts. They increased my anxiety medication. Pills I refused to take because I knew what they were trying to do. And then they left me in room 247 with a roommate who thought it was 1987 and that Ronald Reagan was still president. For 3 months, I lived in that room. I watched television. I read books from the facility library. I asked to use the phone and was told it was being repaired. I asked to leave and was told I was here for my own safety. And I waited, because I'm 73 years old and I've learned that patience and clarity beat panic and rage every single time. On October 4th, Nurse Patricia Chen did a routine bed check at 6 a.m. She found me awake, reading the newspaper and said, "Mr. Henley, how are you feeling this morning?" "The same way I felt every morning for 3 months," I said. "Illegally imprisoned." She'd laughed, thought I was joking. Then she'd looked at my chart. Read the admission notes. Read Dr. Crenshaw's evaluation. Read the notes from every staff member who'd written that I persistently claims he's not sick and lacks insight into condition. And she'd said something that changed everything. "Mr. Henley, do you know what today's date is? October 4th, 2024. "And who's the president?" I told her. "And what did you eat for breakfast yesterday?" "Oatmeal. With raisins. Same thing I've eaten every morning for 3 months because that's what's on the menu rotation." Patricia had closed the chart. She'd looked at me for a long moment. Then she'd said, "I'll be right back." She'd returned 20 minutes later with the facility director, a woman named Helen Morse who looked like she'd just been informed of a lawsuit waiting to happen. "Mr. Henley," Helen had said, "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you know where you are?" "Riverside Memory Care. Room 247. I've been here for 3 months against my will." "And why do you believe you're here against your will?" "Because my son used a fraudulent power of attorney and a paid doctor's evaluation to have me committed so he could steal my house and my savings. I'm not sick. I don't have dementia. I've been telling your staff this since the day I arrived. Helen had opened my chart. Read it. Then she'd said the words that saved my life. Mr. Henley, I'm going to have you evaluated by an independent physician. If that evaluation shows you're competent, we're going to have a serious problem with how you came to be here. The independent evaluation happened that same day. A geriatric psychiatrist named Dr. Sarah Poole spent 2 hours with me. Memory tests, cognitive assessments, questions about my history, my health, my living situation. At the end, she closed her notebook and said, Mr. Henley, there is absolutely nothing wrong with you. You're cognitively intact. You don't belong here, and whoever put you here committed fraud. Drop 100 points if you're still locked in. The revenge starts now. I was released from Riverside on October 5th with a written apology from Helen Morse, a promise that the facility would cooperate with any investigation, and a copy of Dr. Poole's evaluation that stated in clear medical language, patient shows no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment. Admission appears to have been based on fraudulent documentation. I didn't go home. Couldn't. David had sold the house. The closing had happened 2 weeks ago. I'd found out from Helen, who'd checked the property records after I told her what David was planning. The house I'd lived in for 45 years, that Margaret and I had raised David in, that I'd planned to leave to him when I died, was gone. Sold to a young family for $287,000. The proceeds had gone into an account David controlled under the power of attorney. My house, my money, all taken while I was locked in a memory care facility being told I was too sick to understand what was happening. I stayed in a motel that first night, the Quality Inn on Route 23, paid cash. The only money I had was the $140 in my wallet from before David froze my accounts. The next morning, I called the one person I knew who could help me. My lawyer, Frank Kavanaugh. He'd handled Margaret's estate in 2015. He was 78 now, semi-retired, but he took my call. I told him everything. The power of attorney, Dr. Crenshaw, Riverside, the house sale. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then, Bob, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Are you competent right now? Because if I'm going to fight this, I need to know you're capable of understanding what we're doing. I have a written evaluation from Dr. Sarah Poole dated October 5th, I said. It says I'm fully competent. I can send it to you right now. Send it. I did. Frank called back 30 minutes later. Bob, what David did is criminal. Elder abuse. Fraud. Illegal confinement. We're going to bury him. But first, we need to get your assets back and make sure he can't do this again. How long will that take? Weeks. Maybe months. Courts move slowly. I don't have weeks, I said. I have $140 and nowhere to live. Frank was quiet again. Then, there's a faster way, but it's aggressive, and it'll destroy any relationship you have left with your son. The relationship is already destroyed. Tell me what to do. Frank filed an emergency petition on October 7th. Emergency revocation of power of attorney. Emergency freeze on all accounts David controlled. Emergency order requiring David to provide a full accounting of every transaction he'd made under the POA. The hearing was scheduled for October 9th. David showed up with Kenneth Voss, his lawyer. I showed up with Frank and Dr. Poole's evaluation. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Barbara Klein who'd been on the bench for 19 years and had, according to Frank, seen every flavor of elder abuse there is. Frank presented the evidence. Dr. Poole's evaluation. Dr. Crenshaw's conflicting evaluation. The admission records from Riverside. The house sale records. The bank statements showing David had transferred $127,000 from my accounts to his own. Judge Klein had read everything. Then she'd looked at David and said, Mr. Henley, do you dispute any of these facts? David had looked at Kenneth. Kenneth had said, Your Honor, my client acted in good faith based on medical advice that his father was incompetent. Medical advice from a doctor your client selected and paid for, Judge Klein said. while an independent evaluation conducted by a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist found no evidence of incompetence whatsoever. The initial evaluation showed cognitive decline. The initial evaluation was fraudulent, Judge Klein interrupted, and this court finds that Mr. David Henley used a power of attorney in bad faith to illegally confine his father and steal his assets. The POA is revoked effective immediately. All accounts are frozen pending a full audit. And I'm referring this case to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. She'd banged the gavel. David had stared at me from across the courtroom with an expression I'd never seen before. Not shame, not regret, rage. The kind of rage that comes when someone you've underestimated beats you at a game you thought you'd already won. I stared back, and I'd smiled. The funeral was David's last play, his final attempt to make the narrative work. If I was dead, the legal proceedings would stop. The investigation would stop. He could grieve publicly, settle the estate quietly, and keep everything he'd taken. He'd gone to Riverside on October 12th, 3 days after the hearing, and told them I'd died in my sleep. He'd signed a form identifying the body. He'd arranged cremation. The only problem was that I wasn't there. Patricia Chun had done a bed check and found my room empty, because I'd been released a week earlier. She'd called the number David had provided, got voicemail, called the funeral home David had listed. They confirmed they'd received the cremation order for Robert Henley, deceased October 12th. That's when Patricia called me. Mr. Henley, I'm very confused. Your son is telling us you're dead. But you're clearly not dead because you're answering your phone. What's going on? I told her what was going on. She'd contacted the police. The police had contacted the funeral home. The funeral home had contacted David to confirm that Robert Henley had definitely died and yes, they should proceed with the memorial service as planned. David had confirmed everything, because at that point he was committed. The lie was in motion. The funeral was scheduled. Backing out would mean admitting he'd lied. So the funeral happened, and I attended. I sat in the back row and listened to David eulogize me. I listened to his wife Amber read a poem about loss. I listened to my cousin Ellen, who I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, talk about what a wonderful man I'd been, past tense. I'd been. The service lasted 40 minutes. At the end, David invited people to share memories. A few people stood and told stories, most of them invented or exaggerated because I'd never been particularly close to most of these people. Then David said, "Before we close, I want to thank everyone for coming. Dad would have been so moved to see how many lives he touched. And I want to say one more thing." He paused, wiped his eyes. "Dad left me everything. This house, his savings, everything he'd built over a lifetime. And I promise I'm going to honor that legacy. I'm going to take care of my family the way he took care of us. Thank you, Dad. Rest in peace." I stood up. I took off my sunglasses. I walked down the center aisle toward the front of the room. The room went silent. People stared. Someone gasped. David saw me. His face went white. I walked past him to the microphone. I looked out at the 47 people who'd come to mourn a man who wasn't dead. "Hello," I said. "I'm Robert Henley. I'm not dead. But my son held a funeral for me anyway so he could keep the money he stole. I thought you should know." I stepped away from the microphone. I walked past David, who was frozen, mouth open, unable to speak. And I walked out of my own funeral with the absolute certainty that I'd just done the most satisfying thing I'd ever done in my 73 years of life. The fallout was swift and comprehensive. David was arrested the next day, charged with elder abuse, fraud, attempted theft, and filing a false death certificate. Kenneth Voss lost his law license for his role in the scheme. Dr. Crenshaw is under investigation by the State Medical Board. The house sale was reversed. Turns out real estate transactions can be voided when they're made under fraudulent circumstances. I'm back in my house. My accounts are unfrozen. Every dollar David took has been returned. David took a plea deal 6 months ago. 5 years probation. Full restitution. Permanent restraining order keeping him at least 500 feet from me at all times. I haven't spoken to him since the funeral. I don't plan to. His children, my grandchildren, are 12 and 9. I haven't seen them since this started. Maybe I will someday. Maybe not. That's not my decision anymore. I'm 73 years old. I live alone in the house Margaret and I bought in 1979. I'm healthy. I'm independent. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And every morning when I wake up, I think about the fact that I attended my own funeral and came back from the dead to take everything back from the son who tried to bury me alive. If this story reached you, I need to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell me about power of attorney abuse. Tell me if you've seen this happen to someone you love. Here's what I learned at 73. 1. Never sign a power of attorney without understanding exactly what it means. Just in case is how it starts. Fraud is how it ends. 2. Get a second medical opinion. If one doctor says you're incompetent, see another doctor. Dr. Crenshaw was paid to diagnose me with dementia I didn't have. Dr. Poole told the truth. 3. If someone puts you in a facility against your will, keep telling the truth. I told everyone at Riverside I didn't belong there. Eventually, someone listened. 4. Document everything. Dates, conversations, transactions. I couldn't have one in court without evidence. 5. A power of attorney can be revoked at any time if you're competent. Don't let anyone tell you it's permanent. 6. When someone steals from you using legal documents, fight back with better legal documents. Frank Kavanaugh saved my life. 7. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show up where you're not supposed to exist. Walking into that funeral was the moment David knew he'd lost. 8. Your children are not entitled to your assets while you're alive. If they're planning for your death while you're still breathing, they've told you everything you need to know. These stories aren't easy to tell, but I tell them because elder financial abuse is happening right now. Adult children with power of attorney draining bank accounts, forcing parents into facilities, selling houses, taking everything. You can fight back. You can win. I died on October 12th. David held my funeral on October 19th. On October 20th, I came back from the dead and took my life back. If they're planning your funeral while you're still alive, show up. Prove them wrong. Take back what's yours. And let them explain to everyone they invited how they tried to bury someone who's still breathing. If this reached you, share it. Subscribe to Family Reckoning. Comment below. Tell me your story. Thank you for staying to the end. It means everything. One final note. Some elements of this story are fictionalized for narrative and educational purposes. But the core truth that people hold funerals for living parents to steal their money, that's real. That's happening. And it's something everyone needs to know how to recognize and stop.